question of the potential of the turboprop aircraft in the United States. Also, and for anybody else to this conference. Secondly, you get another Georgia Tech. So we had a Georgia Tech professor. I'm a proud Georgia Tech alumnus. I didn't put GT on any of my slides, but I did wear a GT shirt Saturday. So yeah, if I could go and kind of jump right in. Might be quicker. Okay. Yeah, so what we wanted to do first, kind of take a look at what has happened in the U.S. regional market. Our study is a little more classical network planning, looking at historical traffic, looking at schedules, looking at demand. We focused originally, so for example, here we look at markets that had nonstop service. They were under 300 nautical miles. They had at least 10 weekly frequencies, so pretty much double daily or more, with aircraft with 30 or more seats, holiday reserve. So if we look at 2005, we see between 2005 and 2025 in that segment. So these are non-stop markets. These are the OED passengers, so not just looking at connected, purely looking at the non-stop OED. That traffic is down 77% from where it was 20 years ago. The U.S. as a whole is about 35%. So we look at 5.1 million OED passengers annually. Had that market grown roughly comparable to the rest of the U.S., we would have close to 7 million passengers. We get a little over 1 million. So it does not make sense to believe that the demand has just gone away, right? That the GDP is bigger, population is bigger, the economy is bigger. So the underlying unconstrained demand, which is as network planning, is really what we do for. What is the demand? Not just what happened, but what could happen. It is clearly the traffic is a result of loss of service, and a lot of that, the Northeast and the Midwest have lost the most. So what we see is not just looking forward to what might happen with the retirement of 50 seaters, but what has already happened. Lost service, lost traffic, and these passengers have shifted to some other mode of transportation. So how do we look at what might happen? First thing we wanted to look at was the total addressable market. How many OED markets could potentially support turboprop operations? So looking at, is it within range? Let's look at existing capacity, the market demand, and with some cost estimates from ATR, we'll look at the operating cost to fly that versus the revenue that we would project. So first step is take a look at that, wide open, look at everything. Then in step two, to kind of narrow it down, we really looked at one is shortening the range a little bit based on competition. So if there's the airplane's capable of flying more than 300 nautical miles, if there's nonstop competition, we really limited there. We also looked at a minimum level of 2 to 4 daily frequencies, and we looked at airports that can support at least 5 aircraft. The idea on the 2 to 4 daily frequencies is that a lot of the target market that we would look at would be business passengers. You need to cover multiple times a day. The short haul is very hard to get in, very price sensitive leisure passenger. If you've got one flight, you've got kind of an LCC schedule model, it's going to be a hard market. So that was the process we went through. So if you take a look, there's lots and lots of OEDs in the U.S., almost 50,000 that we started with, but we narrowed it down for our market size. If we look now, the market size is pretty limited. Many markets have lost service. We looked at 4 different snapshots from 2005, 12, 2019 before COVID, and then the most recent 12 months. Basically, when the service was there, how many passengers flew? We think that's representative of the demand more so than the current levels, where there's many markets with no service. So, taking a look at that, we focused on markets that had at least 20 passengers per day in the OED market. Again, one of the reasons we focused on OEDs that were a little larger is we not totally dependent on connections. If it's 5%, if it's middle of Denver, you can only even think about that with a partnership with United. So we wanted to look at something where there was potential for both local traffic as well as partnership. And as we went through that 49,000, we looked at 748 markets for potential evaluation. So basically, we built schedules with 2, 3, and 4 round trips for each of those markets. Forecasted what their share would be using our QSI-based market share model. Converted that into trip revenues, trip costs, and looked to see where there could be profitable opportunities. Looking basically currently, before we limited with the base size and other factors, you could be close to 500 potential aircraft. And that number would go up over time as the 50-seaters go away. So we saw significant potential, more profitable operation based on the market size and based on the operating costs. Again, given that the 50-seaters will be going away, certainly that opportunity is going to increase. Where are these opportunities? Well, you can look at a lot of them as focused in the Midwest and Northeast population density and business, which helps. One of the areas is former hubs. Due to industry consolidation, airports like Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, St. Louis have lost a lot of service. That when the service was there, the traffic was there. If you're a Delta and you merge with Northwest, you have a Detroit hub and an Atlanta hub, the Cincinnati hub doesn't make sense, right? The Memphis hub no longer makes sense. The Philadelphia hub, the Pittsburgh hub. So consolidation has taken away service from airports. So there's a number of factors that really just some markets have grown out of that size. The aircraft, the airlines are flying longer stage lengths. They've abandoned some markets, as we've all seen. So going through that process and using our cutoffs, we came up with roughly 165 airplanes where you can have these 5 airplanes, you can have a market size, you can meet all the different criteria that we looked at. And that's, again, representation. That's not the total potential, but that's really the focus of kind of where that opportunity is. So again, we looked at it, over 700 routes, considering all the different constraints on base size, other factors. We saw roughly 165 aircraft covering 127 routes that would make economic sense and have good potential. What I'm going to do at this point is turn over to Dan, who's going to look at a little different method of forecasting. I refer to it as classical, even a little school. So for the next segment, I'd like to invite Dan Percy to come up. Dan is the Director of Business Development. He's been in the aerospace industry for 20 years, started in Airbus. His main objective, or most recent objective, is to find new sources of demand, and he's been looking at GPS cell phone data, what that can tell us. For you, Dan.
Chris. Thank you. And thank you, Rich, as well, for your excellent study. Just to put the numbers that Rich has produced into context, so 165 aircraft is for Part 1 to 1 scheduled airline operations, assessed using historical aviation data, MIDT, sold tickets data. At ATR, we've added a component of demand here, which we won't show today, but it's for the Part 1 through 5 market of another 35 aircraft. So in our forecast numbers for the US market, we see 200 aircraft coming from studies with traditional classic methods of assessing demand. But as Rich mentioned, there's this underlying unconstrained demand. Demand that is actually going by other modes of transport, which obviously you can't see when you look at the lens through historical already flying traffic of existing air carriers. So that's been my challenge over the last few years, is to try and find a way to measure this unconstrained underlying demand. And we've created a tool which we call Mobility Monitor. So both Cedric has talked about it. Alexi also mentioned what we've been doing. But basically, we got a whole load of raw mobile GPS data from American citizens. Now, don't worry, we're not stalking anybody, it's completely anonymized, we don't know who these mobile phones belong to, but nevertheless we do cover 20% of the population, which is a gigantic quantity of people to be tracking. I don't like using the word tracking, but you know what I mean. We're observing their journeys, we turn their raw data into trips, and with the algorithms that we've got, we found 180 million trips, so we have a database of 180 million trips. Each trip, we identify mode data, so if it was just a ground trip, or if there was also an air component, and we can generate kind of really fascinating statistics, some of which Alexi has already delivered. So he mentioned 75% of trips are between 100 and 400 nautical miles, 4% going by air. This shows us a huge market in regional mobility. But what we're interested in these 180 million trips is the ones that can be converted to air. So we have drawn this is a map of catchments, if you like. So normally when we talk about catchments, we're only talking about air. But here we use them to also suck up the trips that are going by ground as well. So 470 catchments across the US, across both scheduled operations, Class 1 airports in Part 139 and Class 2 and 4 for semi-private operations like JSX. 470 catchments, and the O&D combinations of all trips between these 470 account for 80% of all those trips that we have. So these 470 geographical zones, people traveling between them, that's 80% of the unconstrained mobility demand in the US. So 75%, 4%, those are great statistics, but we also wondered, how does the observed demand for unconstrained mobility compare to the structure of the air network? So what we find is, I call it the mobility mountain, because the actual mobility, when we take out the top 31 hubs, or the catchments of those hubs, and study the general mobility, excluding all trips to or from those top 31 hubs, so only the remaining 430 or something, we find that 50% of the unconstrained mobility patterns, people moving around by car, other modes of transport, 50% is between the other 430, so outside of the main hub system of the US carriers. But when we take MIDT data, tickets, and look at the air demand, we see that there's only 10% of air trips are going outside of the hub system. So you've got only 10% of air passengers versus 50%, the great big mountain in the background of the overall mobility. So there is honestly a genuinely gigantic opportunity to create new routes. So Cedric has mentioned air mode share modeling, mode choice modeling. We work together to apply a model to the data and then assess at countrywide level in the US how much of this mobility mountain unconstrained demand do we think can be converted to air. So the top line number is 38 million trips. That's what we think can be converted. So in context, in 2005, if we look at air routes under 400 nautical miles, flown on regional jets or pistons or turboprops, it's about 75 million. So this 38 million is effectively 50% more again of the current air demand flying on regional carriers. Now, what we're interested in is what can be really converted. Some of it would be on routes that are already flown by our operators. We want to be conservative when we produce numbers. So we're going to only select in our conclusions the part in green here, which is what we call uncompeted metro pairs. So what that is basically cities that don't have any flights going between them. And if you have two airports in one city, metropolitan area, and two airports in another city, another metropolitan area, none of those airport pair combinations have an air service. So this is completely new demand, completely different from what has been seen by the Seabury study. Those routes have never been upgraded, and today there is no air service, so people are only going by ground. So that's 12 million passengers, equating to a demand for 110 turboprops across 190 R&D pairs. When we add Rich's pairs and our pairs, we're talking over 300 new R&D routes. The 110 we're interested in both Part 121 operations and Part 135 operations. We can split it accordingly, so we see 60 for Part 121 and 50 turboprops for Part 135. Still, total of 110. Bringing our overall assessment of the demand for turboprops in the US to a little bit more than 300 aircraft. So that's our demand decoded. And Rich, would you like to join me for the conclusions?
So, as I mentioned, these are previously non-stops for regional markets. Just since in the last 20 years, the traffic has declined 37%, revenue a very similar number. And we certainly believe that this is really almost totally driven by lost capacity. This is not a reduction in demand, it's a reduction in service, forcing people to use other modes of travel. Either the 20% that still flies are connecting, taking 5 or 6 hours for a trip that would be much shorter. So most of them are shifting to alternative modes.
And like I said, there's the mobility mountain. There's a huge mountain of unconstrained demand that's currently unexploited, and the part that we see in the networks of the air carriers only represents 1/5 of what we estimate could be harvested by regional carriers, sometimes with new business models, sometimes in coordination with majors. There's lots to do.